Week 5 in Existentialism, where we'll be talking about the existence of love, gender, and human sexuality. In this week's reading from Martin Buber, we'll take a closer look at what he calls the I-thou relation. Keep in mind that Buber draws a difference in kind between the I-thou relation and what he calls the I-it relation. Simply put, in the I-thou relation, one considers the other as a subjective and free being, much like oneself, whereas in the I-it relation, one considers the other as an object, or as a means to an ends. Buber begins by saying that the thou meets me through grace, implying that existentially the presence of another is something that we are immediately aware of. However, to engage with that other, and to speak with them, is a choice that one must make. Inasmuch as the other chooses to engage us, we must equally choose to reciprocate that engagement. And for Buber, this is the most important, quote, act of my being, end quote. For as we will see, it is through one's engagement with the other that one becomes aware of their own character. This engagement with the other can only be done with one's whole being, in such a way as to fuse one's being with that of the other. In this fusion, one ceases to be a singular agent in the world, rather agency is shared between oneself and the others. For Buber, quote, all real living is meeting, end quote. And he goes so far as to say that, quote, the present arises only in virtue of the fact that the thou becomes present, end quote. Life lived in isolation is therefore a false kind of existence for him, a life surrounded only by contents and objects. Buber makes a very good point, that the reason we're able to see objects as objective is because we've always already settled on the meaning of their identity somewhere in our past. The world of objects, or contents, is therefore a world of lifeless memories, dead objects from a defunct past, all of them locked into their determined and destined existences. This is the lifeless and abstract world of science, a world in which our free relations to each other are meaningless. He even goes so far as to call this world unreal. However, we can escape this lifeless and deterministic world simply by turning back to the face of the other again. Like Sartre, Buber believes that a simple look from the other is enough for us to existentially feel and understand the gravity of the other's being in the world. In the face of the other, I see their freedom, but I also realize my own again, for I see them seeing me as a free subject, and not just an object too. In this way, one, quote, makes his appearance by entering into relation with the other persons, end quote. Only in relation to others does the spiritual substance of the person mature, for one is once again able to realize their own freedom. Buber goes on to show us that our existence constantly swings between the two poles of the I-it and the I-thou, a world of objective individuality versus that of subjective, dynamic, and free personality. And he calls on us to do our utmost to uphold the I-thou despite the inevitable return of the I-it. This week's reading from Sartre continues where we left off in week 3. After explaining how the other's look reduces one to an object, and how this objectification fills one with shame, Sartre returns the conversation towards the subject of love. At the bottom of page 194, Sartre reminds us that the love of another is to want to, quote, possess a freedom as freedom, end quote. The love doesn't want to see their beloved as just an object, but wants a glimpse of them in their freedom towards the world. In other words, the lover wants to possess the other as subjectivity, and as the beloved's own being for itself. However, this is technically impossible, for the lover is simply incapable of getting inside their beloved's head and seeing the world as they freely see it. Similarly, the lover also desires that their beloved see them as free, and not just as an object. However, we recall Hegel's arguments from the master-slave paradox that show this is actually impossible. In desiring to control the beloved's freedom to see the lover as object, the lover aims at mastering their beloved's subjectivity, effectively objectifying it and enslaving it to the lover's desire to be master of their own essence. In such a system, the lover would interiorize both their own and the beloved's subjective freedom, and become their own foundation. Yet this is impossible for at least 5 reasons. First, because one cannot be subjective and objective at the same time. Second, one cannot climb inside the mind of another so as to truly control their own essence for others. Third, even if the lover enslaved their beloved and forced their objective viewpoint, it would be, as Hegel showed us, a false viewpoint, merely the projection of one's own idea of one's own essence. Fourth, even enslaved, the, quote, other's awakening is always possible. At any moment he can make me appear as an object, end quote. And fifth, all it would take would be for a third person to walk into the room and everything would be ruined, as both the lover and the beloved would be objectified by that third person. All things considered, we can't escape our own objectification by the other, which is to say that we can't escape a degree of shame in all our dealings with others. nor can we truly experience our own objectivity in the eyes of the other. In masochism, though, one tries to realize oneself as a pure object, which is to say, as the other sees them. They deny their own freedom and attempt to become a completely objective existence that is the same for all people. For example, they'll allow the other to tie them up so that their body becomes a motionless, rigid object, or gag their mouth so that their freedom to speak and express themselves is stopped, or beat their flesh into lifeless submission. However, despite all these tricks, they instead end up driving themselves deeper and deeper into their own mind, which is to say their own subjectivity and freedom, away from the objectivity they seek. Masochism is an act of bad faith, because try as one might to deny or escape their own freedom and subjectivity, one simply cannot. Living involves choices, and ironically the masochist ends up realizing that their choice not to choose was nonetheless still a choice, and an expression of the freedom that they're trying so desperately to flee. Sartre then goes on to define sexual desire and explains its essence. As part of your reading analysis this week, you'll be asked to explain this concept in your own words. Sartre then considers the concept of sadism. In sadism, the sadist doesn't just want to reduce the other to an object and destroy their freedom. Rather, the sadist aims for the other to freely choose their own objectivity. They torture the other so as to break their will while at the same time preserving that will. However, this desire necessarily fails, much like masochism did. For the moment the other looks at the sadist realizes them again as being for itself, and the imperviousness of that being to their tortures. Likewise, the moment their flesh doesn't behave the way the sadist wishes, they realize again the impossibility of fully reducing the other to an object, while at the same time preserving them in their freedom. Finally, if the sadist actually ends up killing the other, their failure will be complete, as the other will then only be an object, and the mastery of the other's for itself, which the sadist craves, will become impossible. Thus, the desire of love, which is a desire to possess and understand the other in both their objectivity and their freedom, and to likewise have them grasp you in your objectivity and freedom, necessarily fails. Against Buber, Sartre doesn't believe in the possibility of an I-thou relationship, and declares that such an experience, quote, is not an intersubjective consciousness, nor a new being which surpasses and encircles its parts as a synthetic whole in the manner of a collective consciousness, end quote. Rather, there is only I in my freedom and the other in theirs, and between them an insurmountable gulf. Love is therefore an illusion, a game to be played out in some form of either sadism or masochism, quote, fleeting experiences without metaphysical bearing, end quote. In the first article by de Beauvoir, she applies the Marxist theory of historical materialism as a means of understanding how women have been historically treated. Throughout, she continues to refine her Marxist analysis so that it is consistent with an existential view of history as well. She begins by asserting that humanity is not just some animal species, defined objectively and presumably determined by instinct. Rather, humanity is made up of free individuals that shape their own historical reality, regardless of sex or gender. This is not to say that we are not part of nature. Rather, we're capable of taking, quote, over the control of nature on its own behalf, end quote, unlike many other creatures. And speaking of the biological nature of women in particular, she believes that there are two biological traits that differentiate women from men. Quote, her grasp upon the world is less extended than man's, and she is more closely enslaved to the species, end quote. However, the degree to which any particular woman is bound by these two traits is relative to the society and economy in which she finds herself. These two biological limits are closely related. Let's begin with the first. When de Beauvoir says that a woman's grasp upon the world is less than a man's, she doesn't mean that women are physically inferior to men. The individual strength of men and women vary, and one can easily find some women that are stronger than some men. Even as a general class, to say that women are generally weaker than men when taken as a whole is largely false today. What individuals lack in physical strength and prowess, de Beauvoir rightly points out that we've more than made up for with modern technology. All things considered, there isn't much that a young, able-bodied man could do that a female senior citizen couldn't do, if given the right tools, training, and opportunity. When de Beauvoir says that women are biologically more enslaved to the species, she means that, strength aside, there's another biological limit that most women face that men simply don't, namely the potential to get pregnant and bear children. To raise and nurse a child without assistance is an incredible burden for any one woman to bear alone. Thankfully, modern society has found legal, social, and economic institutions to help ease that burden, such as sexual equality before the law, maternity leave, legislation against wrongful dismissal from work because of pregnancy, child care benefits and social assistance, access to birth control so that unwanted pregnancy can be avoided, etc., etc. However, none of these are universal, and even here in the United States, almost all of these are under attack to some degree. So the extent to which we've put mothers on an equal footing with childless men and women still has a long way to go, even here in America. De Beauvoir then goes on to point out some flaws in Engels' explanation of how, for many centuries, women came to be a subjugated class. For the most part, Engels attributes this to the advent of private property, a condition of which was that only men could own property. This, he argues, meant that women were predominantly looked upon as property themselves, confined to the domestic sphere, and severely limited in their economic freedom, social mobility, and ability to extend their influence over the world. However, de Beauvoir finds this account far too superficial. Were this the case, the second women were allowed to own private property should have been the end of the economic differences between men and women. And yet, generally speaking, women today still make less than men, hold less seats in public office, and are much less likely to hold an executive position in a major company. In fact, I was reading an article just this week in the Guardian newspaper that mentioned that in the United States, only 20 of the Fortune 500 companies are currently headed by women. Accordingly, de Beauvoir wants to show that there's actually an existential explanation for the subjugation of women that better explains what's going on here. She concludes this piece by suggesting that the historical dominance of men over women is a result of our existential tendency to see any other as a threat, as a, quote, result of the imperialism of the human consciousness, seeking always to exercise its sovereignty in objective fashion, end quote. The antagonism that is developed between the sexes is just one manifestation of this imperialistic trend. This is because what is perceived as different is perceived as other, and what is other we desire to control, as shown in Hegel's master-slave paradox and Sartre's analysis of intersubjectivity. Anthropologically speaking, nearly every so-called primitive society tends to clearly demarcate a female myth and space in contrast to a male one. These primitive dialectics, when combined with our existential antagonisms towards that which is other, eventually culminates in a war of the sexes that plays itself out so long as the otherness of sex and gender persists. Much like racial conflicts or the wars of religion, the otherness of women wasn't grounded in either material or biological fact, but came about because of the perpetuation of a myth of otherness and inferiority. De Beauvoir goes on to offer a critique of socialism, and Soviet Russia in particular. Whereas socialism claims to be a philosophy of eradicating class differences, it is yet to create equality between the sexes. Although she acknowledges that Soviet Russia was able to erase economic class differences to some degree, when it came to differences of sex and gender and the otherness of women in general, in some ways women were worse off than before the revolution. As a socialist herself, de Beauvoir urges her comrades to rectify this immediately, and to treat the, quote, categories of the clitorid and vaginal like the categories of bourgeois and or proletarian, end quote. Likewise, socialists should continue to work to erase all categories of otherness in society, and to create laws and institutions to keep them from re-emerging. In the second reading by de Beauvoir this week, it's on the master-slave paradox and relation. In it, she argues that the dialectic of master and slave that Hegel employs better describes the relation of man to woman. After drawing a number of parallels between them, she then explains what it is that women today demand as an alternative to the antagonisms that have existed between the two. I'll leave it for you to read that on your own. Well, that's it for this week's lecture. Don't forget that your final paper proposal is due, and you also have to complete the reading analysis questions and this week's discussion. Thank you so much.